Hi everyone, my name is Patrick Akio, and if you're interested in platform engineering, how to get stuff done and do it the right way, as well as a little bit of DevOps controversy, then this episode is for you. Joining me today is Luca Galante. He does product at Humanitech, and he's one of the organizers of PlatformCon. I'll put all his links to his socials in the description below. Check him out, and with that being said, enjoy the episode.
Beyond coding.
Because I don't think I ever asked you this, but how'd you get into platform engineering in the first place? Like, what was your kind of journey and where did you find it?
Yeah, so when we started Humanitech, basically we came together as a group of people where not me, but others, like our CTO, for instance, built a platform at Google.
Yeah.
And our COO was also coming from experience building platforms at companies like McKinsey and I'm blanking now on the name. It's the LinkedIn competitor in Europe. But that never really took off. But he was building this still like very large engineer organization, and he was building platforms there as well. And basically, we just realized like, hey, we can get more into it later, but there is this concept of DevOps, which in reality for a lot of companies means pretty painful day to day,
Mm.
both for devs and for ops and infrastructure people. And kind of leading engineer organizations realized this already 10, 15 years ago because they had to onboard, hundreds, maybe thousands of engineers every year. And they immediately realized, okay, this approach of trying to expect everyone to do everything just doesn't scale.
Yeah.
And we need to build some sort of platform layer in between the operations platform team and the rest of the engineer organization to make things more scalable. And so that's what they were building. And we realized, hey, Spotify is doing the same, Airbnb is doing the same. And so the idea behind Humanitech was to sort of, build a product that could provide engineering teams the core sort of configuration engine to build that platform in the enterprise. And so we came up with this concept, which it was, the internal developer platform. And I mean, I want to make clear, we didn't invent anything, right?
Mm.
Like people had been building platforms for a good part of a decade. There was a lack of a community, there was a lack of just share best practices, common terminology, framework, just to like think about these things and talk about them. And that's where we basically started hosting events for platform engineers. And it was in Berlin. We did platform engineers in Berlin. Then we started doing a bunch of groups all over Europe and North America. Now we have about 28 groups, I think, and over 10,000 members. So that kept growing, sorry. And then we progressively started adding more bits and pieces to the community. So we started adding a Slack channel that now has over 8,000 members, really active. That's really the beating heart of the community, if you will.
Yeah.
Then there is platformengineering.org, which is kind of the home where you can see all the upcoming events. There's a job board that there are, defining pieces around what does a platform engineer do and stuff like that. And then we launched PlatformCon last year, which I think was the highlight of the community. We had 7,000 signups, 6,000 attendees just in day one, and people really, really enjoyed it. And so we're gonna double down on that this year as well.
Nice.
And I think the platform engineering community is really, like, I find it really interesting because, like, on the one hand, it provides this sort of safe space for people to connect and share best practices and war stories about their platform failures or successes. And I think that's great, and that's what I think most dev communities sort of provide normally.
Yeah.
I think the interesting thing about the platform engineering community is it also provides this layer around identity on top of it, right? And that's why I think it resonated really well, especially in the early days with very senior practitioners, because again, those are the ones that had been building platforms already. They just didn't know what it was called. They didn't have a shared framework to think about these things and talk about them. And so I think it was like a big relief moment of like, so that's what I've been doing, type of thing. And that was really and so and then we kept building on top of that, and kind of, okay, who is a platform engineer? What does a platform engineer do? How is that different from a DevOps and SRE and so on? And how much does a platform engineer make? Stuff like that. And I think that's been really interesting for people. And now we're seeing a second wave of, I think, less senior practitioners as well,
Mm.
because they've heard about it. It's like, oh, there's this hot new thing in town, platform engineering. I hear it makes good money. Let me
Yeah,
check it out.
it sounds attractive in that way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I like the kind of the notion of identifying yourself with something. And it's interesting because for me, it was really DevOps, interestingly enough, because I came from the operations side coming out of university. I started in operations and then I missed kind of the software development side of things. So then I read online and I saw terms of DevOps, like bringing both sides of that world together. And I was like, yeah, this is really what I would like to do. And that's where I then trended towards more so the software development side. And we still have operational responsibilities. But I can imagine that if you've been doing this kind of things and you've been labeled into something and it's really not a good fit, or you've always been kind of an outlier in your role, and then all of a sudden there's a term on there and the roles and responsibilities or even the things that you're doing is something you've always been doing, then yeah, that's a really powerful thing for someone. They can fully identify themselves with that and
right.
then build on top of that, right? Share kind of their experience and perspective on that, and then you create the community that you've been building, which is really powerful at the end of the day. Uh,
Totally. Yeah, yeah, exactly. And you can really see it, right? Like the community grows, but it's also just really the engagement, the passion
yeah,
of people joining and being there is, you can tell it hit a nerve, somehow.
yeah, yeah. What would you say? So a platform engineer, I have a certain vision of it, but what would you say like the roles and responsibilities are of platform engineers, or more so, kind of that shared responsibility that you've defined?
Yeah. So I think, for me, so if we look at like platform engineering broadly,
Yeah.
like I define it as the art, because it's more an art, I think, than a science of
Okay.
designing. I mean, it's both, but it'll become clear why it's an art. Of designing sort of, and bringing together all the different tech and tools
Mm.
that you have, especially, in mid and large size organizations, enterprise engineering orgs, and bring all of them into a golden path that basically does a number of things. It enables developer self-service, and at the same time, it reduces the cognitive load for the individual contributor, for the engineers.
Yeah.
And these golden paths are basically the superset of this golden path is the internal developer platform, or IDP in short. And the IDP is then built by the platform engineer, which is usually a team, right? It's a platform engineering team or platform team. And the I think a key principle is, and also I think what differentiates platform teams and platform engineers from more traditional roles like SRE or DevOps is this approach of platform as a product,
Yeah.
which means you really want to treat your developers, the rest of the engineering organizations, as your internal customers.
Mm.
And you are really shipping a product, which means, you are shipping features. You have a PM usually. And in fact, the product management channel in the platform engineering Slack is probably one of the most active. People are always trying to figure out if you like a lot of open things, because there's still there's still a lot of questions around, like, what are the best practices? How do you get internal buy-in? How
Yeah.
do you get executive buy-in? How do you roll out? All these things are really like this product questions. And and it's a team. In a lot of cases, you have front end, back end, QA, so it's really like a product team.
Okay.
And this requires, I think, a really not just a different set of skills, but I think importantly also a mindset shift towards, hey, we're here to serve our customers who are the internal developers, And you really need to, think hard about how do you build that tight feedback loop between the developers and the platform team so that
Yeah.
you can iterate and then you have rollout strategies. Where do you start? Usually we see successful platform teams starting from, picking one dev team because, in an ideal scenario, you have a greenfield setup
Sure.
where there's nothing, platform team decides everything, rolls it out. Great. That is pretty much never the case. What we see is, very complex brownfield enterprise setups where you have, tens of different teams and each one of them has their own preferences around I use Jenkins. I use, Jenkins plus Argo. I use Circle CI plus that, right? And it's like everyone has their own sort of like delivery setup.
Yeah.
And so then the goal of the platform team becomes to find that minimum common denominator that solves as many problems at the same time as possible for as many teams as possible, but then focus on usually the more advanced teams within the org that are the ones that are probably more comfortable, if the golden path is not perfect and they can go off path, meaning, they can, I don't know, mess around with the Helm charts or stuff like that. And, and then basically once they nail that, start rolling out team by team and making sure that that minimum common denominator stays sort of valuable for everybody.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that you say that the platform team is kind of a cross-functional team. So you have back-end engineers and even front-end engineers in that, because I thought it would just be people building that platform, right? There's no real front-end component in there. And then the challenge I would see is, right, you're building a product and that product is for internal developers. So probably what you need to know out of more than anything, or maybe not more than anything, I think it's a big component, is developer experience, right? So what makes a developer experience really solid and really good? Like, what does that even mean? That you need to know as a platform team, because otherwise the product that you're building is for the wrong developers, right? Or you're solving the wrong solutions in that way.
Right.
And I thought then if you only have one, let's say, competency within that team, that's going to be harder because you're not going to have developers that like build features and stuff like that and ship that out to other customers or outside customers, I guess. But if you say it's a real cross-functional team, then that challenge becomes a little bit more manageable, I guess. Like how does a team like that structure itself? It's cross-functional, you mentioned?
Yeah, and I think it depends, heavily also. So the way I think about platform engineering and what we advocate for in the community
Yeah.
is providing platform teams with a unopinionated toolbox,
Okay.
basically, to build opinionated workflows. What does that mean?
Mm.
Um, that, if you think about the key difference between I guess like a predecessor of the IDP, which is a pass. So something like an Heroku for people that are familiar with that.
Yeah.
Um, what a pass says is, hey, I have looked at the market and I have formula or the product team behind the pass says, I've looked at the market. I found the minimum common denominator that I believe it's valuable for, as many teams as possible. And I have ingrained that in a framework that is, you know, great to get started really quickly, but it's really not very flexible,
Mm.
right? Um, and so that worked really well. Like, right, Heroku was really popular, but it kind of, I think, flattened out at some point because people realize it's great for greenfield setups for teams of a certain size. We usually, as a rule of thumb, say below 30, 50 engineers. Like, it passes probably a great solution.
Yeah.
But if you go beyond that, you'll start having to be a lot more flexible in the golden paths that you need to build for your org and for the different teams. And so having a solution like a pass becomes really hard. And so the the idea is, hey, here's a toolbox, a set of principles, design principles, best practices, and so on, to go and build your IDP. And the key thing about an IDP is that the platform team will, depending on what is the context of their engineering organizations that they're working and shipping for,
Mm.
is they'll pick the right paths and the right level of abstraction. And I think that's really important because, you know, you'll have different types of users. So you'll have the junior front end maybe that doesn't care whether the application is running on GKE, on EKS, whether it's running Kubernetes at all,
Yeah.
doesn't matter. Like they just wanna, deploy a simple change to their app and see the result and test it in some environment. That's it. Um, but then you also have, your senior backend maybe that really loves messing around in YAML files and Helm charts and so on and so forth. And so the question is, what do you do, right?
Yeah.
And that's where it becomes really hard to take this like pass approach of like boop, like here's the solution for all your problems. It's unlikely to work and scale at an enterprise size. And so instead is how can build a product team that really has this tight feedback loop with the different other product teams, right? The different dev teams, and really, builds this paths and off paths options for everyone to kind of use. And there are a few kind of like key principles that we talk about when we talk about platform engineering. One is platform as product. The other one that I mentioned earlier is you want to focus on this like common problems. Like, but then the other, I think the other things that are really important are, this concept of being the glue
Okay.
is really valuable, right? Like you really platform engineers need to make sure that they tie together all these different tech and tools in one golden path that really makes sense and
Mm.
that optimizes for reduction of cognitive load and frustration, honestly, right? Because
Yeah.
what you see in a lot of I think engineering orgs today is you have a DevOps team and you have the rest of the developers, and as the with this converging trends of cloud native, Kubernetes, IAC, GitOps, and all of it together, and this like crazy CNCF landscape with like hundreds of thousands of different tools. Then now, in a lot of situations, if I'm a developer and I just want to deploy a simple change to a dev environment and test something, or I want to spin up a preview environment to do that, I've seen many enterprise organizations where that can take you like 1 or 2 weeks just to get
Yeah.
an environment, just to get a database provision and so on. And so that creates all sorts of waiting times, frustration on the developer side. And on the operation side, you become a glorified help desk that is just trying to put off fires and, fighting ticket ops constantly. And so the idea of having this glue, of building this golden paths
Yeah.
is really to provide this layer on the one hand for developers to just self-serve what they need to run their apps and services, independently.
Yeah.
And then operations can focus on I think better, more interesting problems, let's say, than provision the same PostgreSQL for the 10th time.
Yeah. Interesting. One of the things that you mentioned still kind of lingers in my mind in that, right, if you start out on a green field, like if you start out on a brown field, you can kind of find your common denominators because you already know what people are using. You might want to standardize some things here and there, and then it makes sense to like have a platform team specifically that caters towards your internal developers. But when you said on a greenfield side of things, it would be better if a platform engineer already starts with that. That for me is hard because for me, it's like a chicken and an egg problem, right? You first need to figure out what your developers actually use and what they need because they have to figure that out with the product they're building. So if you don't have that, then how can you make a platform that already like is going to make the developer experience better if the developers don't even know what they're going to use at the end of the day, right? If you're in a really fast mode, you might choose some databases initially and then later on figure out that other databases are more apt for the product that you're building. But if you from the start already have a platform team, then they're going to have to provision different things, or their golden path is going to be very flexible or malleable, especially at the early on stage. But you still think starting with a platform team kind of in a greenfield setting is a good step in that way? What have you seen?
So I think that's a really good point. I think, from the platform team perspective, that is the dream,
Mm,
because it feels easier. But I think you bring up a really good point, which is you then are missing a initial starting point
yeah,
that tells you already what the preferences of your developers are. And so I still believe it can be more ideal if you have those conversations, those lines of communication with the different dev teams in place, right?
yeah,
But yeah, communication is everything, and I think that is one of the things that um, I think trends in the like up and to the right, like going from the sort of like ancient sysadmin that was living in a basement trying to figure out servers,
mm,
and then to the DevOps and now to the platform engineer. I think there is just like a correlation on increasing, like you need better communication skills,
yeah,
and you really need to make sure that you can listen to developers, but not just developers, that you're able to, sell up to management and executives to get full stakeholder buy-in, and really think about all different stakeholders. There's also one thing that I've seen in large organizations, like an example, Salesforce,
yeah.
um, is multiple platform teams competing,
Okay.
right? So then you add the extra layer of complexity where you're really in a race with each other, and it's really, which I think is healthy. It can be, obviously there can be some, like pros and cons like in everything, but may the best win
Yeah.
is a good kind of like self-selection process, and that becomes really interesting because then you're really like not just a product but a company almost. Like you really need to think about your distribution and almost like your internal go to market,
Yeah.
versus the other. But that's really just for very large organizations, right?
I can
Like
imagine.
yeah, in most companies it's hard to even get one platform team working.
Yeah, but I mean, it's for me, it's the ideal situation, right? And
Right.
you might think it's strange because obviously, if there's multiple platform teams, why just not join them together and make one Uber platform? Like I've heard a lot of stakeholders say that. Like, shouldn't we join forces and do that? But at the end of the day, like bunching up a bunch more people, if you have a really big team, is going to have so much overhead in communication and sharing a mental model of what the thing is we're actually building or what problems we're solving. In that, if you separate that, then obviously there's going to be at some point you can see some teams going faster or having better results than other teams. And then even with the teams that are not going as fast, there's learnings there, right? So if you then centralize that, then you can build the best solution in there. Except that's going to have a lot of people, a lot of resources and time and money in that way. So then it doesn't sound as efficient. But if you're looking at the end product, the end result,
Yes.
I think at the end of the day, that will be better just by virtue of that, which is pretty
Totally.
cool. So in larger organizations, I do see value in that. For me, I'm really looking into kind of a startup phase in a more so project
Yeah.
oriented thing, because that's kind of the team setting that I am in now with the project that we're doing. And we envision multiple teams working on this product that we're building in different teams and cross-functional teams and a future platform team. But right now, the future is not there yet. So we have
Yeah.
platform engineers, but they're in the kind of cross-functional teams that deliver the product at the end of the day. And they're very close to whatever needs to be done, right? And if they have to build software, they'll build software. But more so when there's a platform component, they already start figuring things out when it comes to standardizing that and rolling that out and making that easier for the future also. But I have seen that there needs to be a balance in there, because if you really
Yeah.
leverage or really focus on making it easy to roll out and making it configurable and stuff like that, and then the development team decides, oh, this is actually not like good for our use case anymore, or we're shifting or we're pivoting because of new learnings, then yeah, that kind of feels wasted. So I do feel like there needs to be a balance in there. But the best way to figure that out is to have the platform engineers then be really close to the development team. That's how
Yeah.
I would start out.
You need that feedback loop, and also you need, I think, frankly, a platform team that doesn't fall in love with their own product,
Mm.
right? Where it's like, no, I've built this thing, this is the perfect thing, shut up, use it. It's like, and you keep iterating because, as you said, like the needs will really change, right? You have in some cases, maybe like at the early beginnings usually, and this is where I feel like a platform is almost not needed, right? If you're
Mm.
like 20 engineers and you're all, senior engineers, you're all comfortable handling your Helm charts and your IC modules and so on and so forth, then I mean, you don't really need a platform. Like that would be an overhead at that point, an overkill,
Yeah.
right? But like as you start scaling, that becomes less and less true. And then you have this like more junior people that have never used Kubernetes before, people that have never used Terraform before. And then you need to like make that minimum common denominator like broader and broader.
Yeah.
And then you get to a point where like, all right, now we really need this like, high level golden paths where for the senior backend that's been here for 3 years, it's still like they can still mess around with the files, but maybe we have some like boilerplate templates that we control as a platform team. And then for the more junior folks, you have just like effectively like a click ops UI, you know, um, to do things that is obviously like is more restricted, feels more like a pass, but that's fine for that use case, right? And so you need to keep it really flexible.
Yeah, that's interesting to me as well. Have you or have you seen in the community people going more towards managed solutions as well, or managed cloud solutions? Like I get the Heroku example in kind of a PaaS solution, but a lot of cloud offerings are now more so managed in the fact that you give it a configuration and it scales up things automatically, where people maybe even choose less for Kubernetes or even a more so managed version. Then the
Mm-hmm.
operational overhead, because it's managed, becomes lesser, right? So then I think also the strain on the platform team becomes lesser because of that. But then their role and responsibility more so, I think that's maybe my vision, becomes more so configuring that to the best way it can be,
Yeah,
right, for the use case, and so on and so forth. And then the development team doesn't really have to figure out how to do that or what the best way is, because that's kind of a
correct.
it's kind of a different ball game. That's a different playing field in that way. To optimize for what you're doing, you need the knowledge to
Correct.
do so in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. Like the job of the platform team is really to take this toolbox that I was talking about and then, and then there's different types of toolboxes, right? There's
Yeah.
the kind of like GitLab all-in-one DevOps platform, which I think, is still a bit reminiscent. I don't know that word in English, but like,
Reminiscent.
yeah, of, of a pass,
Yeah.
really, if we're being honest. What we see in the vast majority of cases for like kind of your mid-sized to large-size enterprise is homegrown open source
Mm.
tools like patched together, basically. And so you have your like your Terraform, your Argo. Some people put it like a backstage on top type of thing. And that's great. Like that works for a lot of folks.
Yeah.
What we see though, especially for a lot of those like mid-sized, also to large-sized teams that just don't have a lot of the necessarily like platform engineering capabilities in-house yet,
Yeah.
is you are reinventing the wheel,
Mm.
right? Because yes, there's a tons of open source which is out there and it's great, but the challenge is to figure out which tools work best with each other, and there's really a lack of reference architectures and blueprints right now, which
Okay.
is why we actually one of the tracks of PlatformCon this year is called Platform Blueprints, because I
Mm.
think we're getting to a second stage of the platform engineering movement where at the beginning the last like year and a half 2 years it was really just about like hammering this idea of like, hey, if you want real true you build it you run it, platform engineering is a way of doing it, at the enterprise especially. And now people are like, all right, I'm sold. Where do I go next? Like, where do I start? And there's very little, when it comes to starting points and blueprints and just, shared architectures that people can look at. And so
Yeah.
that's something that we're focusing on community wise this year. But yeah, and so that's why I think, that's kind of, the value prop with Humanitech is take this like core configuration engine and then go build your opinionated workflows on top of it for your org, but don't try and reinvent the whole logic, of configuration management and how, resources are provisions and all that stuff, because that's what we see a lot of teams just doing the same work over and over again.
Yeah.
Because everybody's a special snowflake, but actually they're not really.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because when new tools come out, step one is to figure out how to get this thing working, right? How to get things done with it or how to use it to leverage whatever you want to do. And when you have a bunch of tools, you do that, you get stuff done with that. And at some point you're like, okay, maybe this is not the best way, but this is our way. And you talk to other people and you learn about what they've done. And then all of a sudden you kind of have shared better practices until they become best practices. And those might be within your organization, but if you standardize that, then people that are new to that and that are in kind of the starting phase, they don't have to reinvent the wheel, right?
Yeah.
Because then those that already have done and figured out how to get stuff done, they can educate those on what they've done. And then all of a sudden you kind of have a shared methodology of how to do the thing in the first place and how to do it right, because that's the most important part. That makes it sustainable towards the future and flexible probably, because the future is kind of unknown in that way as well. I like that
Yeah.
notion of like figuring out your internal golden paths and then even maybe standardizing it. It's never going to be a silver bullet, right? And you're
No,
always going to have options, but at least kind of defining a blueprint for other people to hold on to or to learn from. I think that's very valuable.
totally. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, so that's what we're trying to do. And I think like you mentioned being like, you know, uh, sustainable. I think that's really a keyword where you really need to think hard. I think so. Let's say you're Google. Of
Mm.
course, you need to like build everything internally
Yeah.
because your requirements are going to be so specific and custom. And in fact, I mean, they have like tens of different platforms, right? Because they're so huge.
Yeah.
But you really need to look at like the ROI of these things and think about, okay, um, you know, how much can I build from scratch? How much can um, you know, how much time can I put into this? Because the average sort of like platform initiative that we see is a year to 2 years.
Mm.
And the issue a lot of times, and something that, in the community we warn people against is like, hey, it doesn't end there, right?
Yeah.
Because people are like, yeah, build the platform, great. But that's actually where the work starts is then you're like iterating on this product and that, takes like FTEs, takes resources and so on and so forth. And so, I think that's one thing that also this I think blueprints, and we also have another track that is an impact track that's more geared towards the understanding the value
Mm.
of the and the ROI of platforms for management, and helping engineers sell it internally,
Yeah.
but also making sure that everybody, all the stakeholders internally, are aligned around this concept of um, you know, what are the expectations of value creations and what are the costs? Because the costs are really not trivial.
Yeah.
So it's important to keep that in mind.
Yeah. It's interesting because what you mentioned, like I can see that from a product building perspective, and obviously that then holds true if your platform is your product. But looking at it, let's say I'm a software team and people are building things and we're working towards a go live. You have people that really thrive in that kind of early on stage, right? And then when you're live, as you mentioned, then you get more so faster customer feedback. So then you can iterate and test your assumptions faster and move on to delivering more features and more value in that way. But for some software engineers, that stage becomes then less interesting because they really like the early startup things where they get to test and they're really good at that, fast iterating, testing what really feels good and what doesn't based on the use case that they have. And
Yeah.
more so the iteration part once they're live, that's not really their forte because then they're building on top of what they already have. Is that kind of the same for platform engineers? Because I can imagine you build towards like releasing more value for your developers, that developer experience in that way. I don't know if it's the same or comparable to going live with certain features, but I can imagine some are. And then obviously, once you are live and once you're happy with kind of 90% of your platform, and that then becomes, or then you move into kind of that iteration phase, I can imagine some platform engineers, then that's really not their forte as well. Is that kind of comparable in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. You have the kind of like the 0 to 1 people, right?
Yeah.
And then the one plus, and so I think it's the same thing. Like you'll have the people that, and especially I met a couple of sort of like senior consultants and people that have built a bunch of platforms, and they really enjoy this, starting from scratch phase where they enter into a company, it's a disaster or whatever,
Yeah.
and then they spend like 2 3 years and they build it and they put it in the wild, they set up the team, and then you have another team that basically takes over from there, and off you go, right? And that's great. I think that is the ideal scenario, to be honest. I think that the issue is a lot of times people don't think about phase two,
Yeah.
right? And it's like, oh, we have an issue. Platform seems to be a potential solution. Let's explore, let's build one. But without a concerted initiative internally to keep driving this and understanding that this is not a 1 or 2 years project. This is probably a 5 10 years depending on the company.
Yeah. Interesting. Also, based on what you were saying, I wonder, let's say you have kind of a bigger or medium-sized organization, even a large one, and there's no platform team, right? So we have separate development teams kind of doing their own thing, even making their own solutions or choosing their own stuff resource-wise in what they need for production. At some point, I can see it would be good to standardize that, right? And a platform team would kind of build that solution towards that. But if there's no platform team, who's going to advocate for creating such a team in the first place? Like, where have you seen that coming from an organization? Like, is that the engineering managers? Is that a CTO? Is that the developers themselves? Like, where does that inkling or that idea usually come from?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I've seen it coming from both sides of the
Mm,
equation. So either the engineering manager who's just really frustrated
yeah,
with her engineers, not being able to deploy, or yeah, just like her own day to day, and like, "Oh, this sucks. Like, why does it take so long?"
yeah,
But I think honestly, probably I would say. Um, 80%, 70 to 80% of cases is actually the ops side of the equation.
okay,
Because they're the ones that I think suffer most
mm,
in most cases. So to give an example, if you are, so the ops side of the equation will suffer in pretty much in all company sizes.
yeah,
Whereas at the large company, both the developers and the ops are really frustrated because the problems that platform engineering addresses get worse as the engineering org size grows, right?
mm,
So you have a certain point where it's just so bad for everybody involved that
yeah,
when everybody's like, oh my god, yes, platform, like let me sign now.
mm,
Um, but if you think about maybe a case where you have, a couple of hundreds engineers and it's a more advanced engineering organization where, engineers are more confident, like handling certain things. And then they
yeah,
really just need help with that, like the extra, like the final 20% of, deployments, provisioning, infrastructure, stuff like that. Then from the point of view, is a bit of this like tragedy of the commons, right? Because from the point of view of the company and the org, the engineering org, it's still a net positive to implement a platform.
yeah,
But from the perspective, the selfish perspective of the developer, now I just slack my ops team, and
yeah,
usually they get back, within a couple of hours, problem solved, great. To okay, now I need to learn this new, you know, platform thing. It maybe interrupts my workflow, type of thing.
mm,
And so from their perspective, it can be like a net neutral or maybe even a net negative, right?
yeah,
And so that's where those are the scenarios where we see, the ops slash platform teams like really keen to push because their reality still is a lot of ticket ops coming in. So it still sucks for them, but not so much for the developer. And that's where I think again it's really important for the platform team and the developers to have a really shared vision around how do we create an on ramp for platform for developers to access the platform and make sure that it fits in the existing workflow as best as possible. And that's really important, right? So for instance, one learning that we made has been to, you know, most engineers really enjoy, you know, they're really used to like a fully code based kind of like workflow
Yeah.
where they deploy and everything is Git based and so on and so forth. And so trying to impose a ClickHops UI type of thing where now all of a sudden they need to jump out of their you know, code-based workflow into some UI and try and figure this thing out that they've never really seen. And, you know, it's not like, oh, I'm learning this new skill that probably means I get like a pay raise the next job. Not even, right? It's
No.
just like, it's just kind of annoying now. And that's where we see, for instance, platform initiatives fail when they really focus on this like dashboard like thing. Why? Because a lot of times, especially from the perspective of, you know, management or people that need to, you know, sign off on this like rollout, it's really great. The idea of having this like service catalogs, of having this, you know, beautiful one place, one, you know, pane of glass to see everything. But
Yeah.
that's not where the issues are. Usually the issues are around like configuration management, infrastructure provisioning. They're a level deeper, and it's not, and so it's not about just putting, you know, there's this guy Lee that built a platform with Apple, and he wrote an article on platformengineering.org that is called something like along the lines of, if you put a pane of glass on top of a pile of shit, all you see is shit.
Yeah.
And that is, you know, the idea of, you know, you really want to focus on what are the core issues that block developers in the day to day. And in our experience, that's really around configurations and infrastructure provisioning. It's not about, you know, how do I template my service, you know, and then start from there. And
Yeah.
so it's really important for platform teams to just figure out, how do I fit this into the developer workflow in a way that makes sense. And that's where we see fully code based interfaces, right? Like using YAML files and stuff like that as the best, again, minimum common denominator across the board.
Interesting. Yeah, I think the challenge or the biggest challenge I see for a platform team is really just figuring out where the value is. And that puts, I mean, that responsibility lies with the product manager at the end of the day, right? And because they're building a product to people that are more technically oriented, right? Developers in the first place, does the product manager also need to have like a lot of technical knowledge in that way? I can imagine like a previous life of developer experience would help in that, but that might also bias them towards solutions which might be outdated. Like I feel like there needs to be a balance in technical information, but not too
Yeah.
much in that way also.
Absolutely. And that is why, you know, if you check out the product management channel on the Slack space, like that is one of the most, is where probably I honestly find some of the most interesting conversations and threads
Yeah.
going on. Because yeah, as you said, it's like a really fine line and a really fine balance that you need to find. And then really think hard about where in this like value chain the most value lies in terms of the problems that you can solve.
Yeah.
And one of the issues, not to bash, you know, service catalogs and backstage, like we actually work really closely with their team. They're really active in the community, but like it's important to understand one of the fallacies that we see a lot of teams fall into is, and my battery is dying, so I'll plug it in a second. But like, is the idea of you know, basically looking at the workflow of developers chronologically. And
Mm.
so they say, okay, we need a platform, and you know, we want to improve DevOps and blah blah. They start like, you know, top down,
Yeah.
and then they say, okay, what's the first thing the developer does? Oh, you know, she creates an application, a service, whatever. And so that's when they start thinking, okay, how do we optimize that step, right? And then it's like, oh, service catalogs. You can see all the services that other teams are using, blah blah blah. And like that is okay in practice, except that step, like, you know, changing that step, you know,
Mm.
maybe improves, you know, your efficiency by 1 or 2%.
Yeah.
Instead of looking at like where is the actual like hyper painful part, you know, of the developer, which is usually actually like handling the other 10 tools that come after that just to deploy something
Yeah.
or provision something, right? And so that's where, you know, um, you want to build a platform that takes all of that into consideration, but usually you want to start from where you can deliver more value, not where people start chronologically. And that's like one of the anti patterns, if you will, that
Mm.
we see emerge sometimes.
Yeah, interesting. I've never had that role, but obviously with my kind of software engineering hat on, or goggles on rather, I would sit next to software engineers and either pair up on a problem and see what they really face either in deploying their stuff or putting their stuff into production, right? Because that's kind of the end station of things. That's where it ends for them once it's live, or maybe even looking at like the information they gain from that. But still, I think that experience will give you the most insights in the pain points, right? And if that is build time, or if that is kind of the tooling, the other tooling that they're using, then that should be kind of your number one priority, because that's going to deliver the most value. That's going to make their experience better or more efficient, or it's going to make them more effective in the first place. And I
Totally.
think as a team, that is the responsibility. So starting with, like, it's similar to being as close to your customers as possible, except your customers are developers in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the issues that we see there is when it's top down,
Mm,
and it's like, oh, we need to, CIO X reads article Y about,
that's a
technology
problem.
Z, and like, oh, that's great. Like, we need to roll it out. And then we see a lot of people coming in. It's like, so
Yeah,
we have been told we need to adopt this thing. What do we use it for?
mm,
you know, and just try to figure out from there, which is obviously not ideal. And sometimes you just have this, inefficiencies, especially in large organizations where, platform teams. It's like if you think about like a startup in the wild, if you were going to try and solve the 1% problem instead of the 80% problem, you would just fail.
yeah,
You wouldn't build a sustainable business. And the problem is because you don't have a lot of times in this large orgs that feedback in terms of like does this team even make sense to exist, then you just have these initiatives that make little sense.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. One of the last thoughts I still have is kind of a controversy I saw online where I don't know exactly where it came from, but it was all over Twitter a few weeks back. And it was like DevOps is dying and platform engineering is the way to go. What is your take on that? Do you see kind of a trend declining for DevOps and people moving more towards like building platforms as a product in that way? Or will it work better hand in hand? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that was a really funny story, I think.
Yeah.
And we it wasn't actually us putting that out there at the beginning, but we definitely saw it. It came out from actually an interview of our CTO with a YouTube channel, and then the recap was this like very catchy uh, DevOps is that long live platform engineering, and we thought, all right, this is brilliant, let's run with this. And and that exploded to an extent that I never thought it would. But I honestly think it really it triggered a lot of people, but it also triggered a really healthy conversation in the space that I think
Yeah.
was really needed. Because look, I think from my perspective, when DevOps came up more than 10 years ago, the world was a very different place.
Yeah.
We mainly developed monoliths, maybe running on bare metal. We had incredibly less complex infrastructure. There's no Kubernetes, no GitOps, no all the cloud native stuff that we were talking about earlier. And the initial idea behind DevOps is a great idea, which is remove the barriers between devs and ops and facilitate collaboration. Um, that's great, but the reality of that is very different. So many organizations don't pay, I think, enough attention to the culture or challenges, which is not the fault of devs, not the fault of ops or DevOps team at all. But they're just like, the, with this increasing complexity of all these trends, coming together and converging, the reality of DevOps is what we were describing earlier, which is developers are blocked, they're afraid of messing something up, and then you have this role of the DevOps, which in itself is a bit of a contradiction. That basically is doing all this ticket ops and trying to survive. And so the idea of platform engineering, from my perspective and from our perspective, I think in general across the community, is to enable true you build it, you run it. which is the core tenet at the heart of DevOps, right?
Yeah.
And what that means is now developers can actually self-serve tech and tools to deploy, run, and operate their applications and services. And they can actually do that without depending on your ops DevOps team. And your ops DevOps team can actually focus on building a platform for developers or on SRE, maintenance, reliability, and just better challenges than, setting up all this like fighting ticket ops constantly, basically. And so I think that conversation is a really healthy conversation to have, especially because, so another thing that happened is as Humanitech, we went to KubeCon Detroit, and you have to submit your booth designs 2 months in advance.
Yeah.
And this was when we had to the whole DevOps is that thing. I literally just started, and I was like, oh, this is great. Like, this is gonna get a lot of conversation started. Let's do it. And then this whole thing explodes completely out of hand. And then we're like, all right, now this is our booth. But it was incredibly interesting because you had all these people, DevOps engineers, that would walk up to the booth really angry, some of them, right? Because they were like, what the fuck? Like, I'm a DevOps engineer. I'm alive. Like, what are you talking about? And I kid you not, every single one of them, by the end of it, was like, we hugged it out. They all walked out with our DevOps is Dead t-shirt, which is a sick design. And they were like, thank you. This is actually a really important conversation to be had in the community. And I think on the flip side of that, the people that were more protective are, the people that sell DevOps, that are, within that like loud minority, Twitter bubble, which is also very much, mirroring who are the sort of exhibitors at KubeCon.
Yeah.
And I think are the people that have an interest, in gating these concepts, and I think are straight up in some cases a little bit delusional, because they live in this world where like, oh no, DevOps is here to make a world a better place. I'm like, no, it's not. It's a philosophy that started as something that is incredibly valuable, but the reality of people not working and selling DevOps, but actually living DevOps in their engineering organizations is quite different in a lot of cases. And so I think there's been this growing gap between, the industry experts and the actual practitioners, and they don't really speak. And so that's what we are hoping to kind of address with the platform engineering community, is create a space for people to address these things in honesty. And, I think like most disciplines and trends, like eventually it morphs into something else, and eventually you have a ingrained caste almost that protects it, because they've so much invested interest in that. So very likely it will happen the same thing probably for the platform engineering at some point. But I think now we're hoping that it just freshens up the conversation, because I think it's needed.
Yeah, I think that's it's a trigger and it's a marketing thing, right? DevOps is dead. But the people that come to you angry and want to start that conversation, those are the most passionate people you're going to get, because they care, right? If they didn't care, they wouldn't walk up to you. They wouldn't be like, what the hell is this? They care and they want to have that conversation. And if you can bring the value to them and have that conversation in a healthy way, I think that's just a win-win on both ends, right? Because then you share experiences, you share perspectives, and then their horizon gets broader in and of its own, to the point where they get the t-shirt and they love the phrase. I think that's really cool.
But that's a really key point that you bring up, which is having the healthy conversation. And that's one thing that I've realized when we were at KubeCon, which was like, okay, it's great to have this in-person interaction where you can really take the time to explain what we mean, right? And then that trigger is really, a great top of funnel, like drive into that conversation, then you have the conversation. The issue with the online version of that was, because it got so viral, the velocity of that message was just too high for the velocity of the conversation to catch up to it, which meant, I think in a lot of cases, people got it without any context. And then I think it can do more harm than good, which is why we completely dropped that, and we're rephrasing it more towards keep talking about the challenges DevOps burnout and like other ways of phrasing it, but not necessarily DevOps is dead. But it's funny, it's funny to see 6 months later, still all these articles popping up
Yeah.
literally every week on like, is DevOps dead? My take. And frankly, I can't see them anymore. It's just like too many.
Yeah, I mean it's super catchy, and that's
catchy,
how I got.
catchy, yeah.
Yeah, that's how I saw them as well. I want to round it off here, Luca. Is there anything you'd still like to share with our audience that's listening in?
I mean, come check out the platform engineering community. So platformengineering.org or platformcon.com. Those are kind of the main sites. And then from there, you can join the Slack, which, as we said, has got over 8,000 practitioners, is super active. PlatformCon 23 is coming up in June, 8th and 9th. We recently just relaunched the website a couple of weeks ago. It's completely free. It's virtual, so everybody can join. And we're going to have, probably 150, 200 amazing talks. And I think that's really a good place for people to start if they want to check out platform engineering, see what it's all about.
Yeah, sounds awesome. I'm going to put all those links in the description below, as well as links to Luca's social. Luca Galante, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Yeah, it's Italian. Yes. So I'll put his socials in the description below. Check him out, reach out to him, let him know you came from our episode. And with that being said, thank you for listening. We'll see you on the next one.